Okay, well, we're back to philosophy, and we're on a final stretch here, so you're going to get a few uploaded YouTube lectures in addition to the on-ground lectures that we do at CC of the Harbor. Two things we're going to share today, and it's going to come fast. One is a few philosophical ideas out of Ecclesiastes, and then I'm going to share with you an argument that Oxford Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne gave over at either Chapman University or Biola back in 2012. And that paper is called, "What Kind of Necessary Being Could God Be?" What kind of necessary being could God be? Now first, as far as happiness and satisfaction for the believer and so on, Paul Tillich actually said an ultimate commitment to anything less than the ultimate will not ultimately satisfy. Now, I believe Paul Tillich pulled that actually from Solomon. And in Solomon, we find, of course, statements similar to this one: nothing less than the ultimate can ultimately satisfy. Why? Number one, what makes a person happy? You have the East versus the West on those issues. Some say, if you add to your possessions, it'll satisfy you, but we know that's temporary, and that would be materialism. To add something, to your possessions will ultimately make you happy. The world will tell you that would be materialism. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Buddhism, which says take away from your passions. In other words, if no desires, no problem. The Bible, however, says redirect your passions toward God. So an infinite thirst will never ever be satisfied with the finite. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says an eternal desire will never be content with the temporal, loosely paraphrased. So having said that, a little bit of wisdom from Solomon and Tillich. Now moving on to Richard Swinburne, brilliant philosopher at Oxford University. He gave a lecture on what kind of necessary being God could be. Within the attributes of God, as a brief intro, you have what we call the simplicity of God. The simplicity of God. When we say God is simple, it doesn't mean sophomoric. It means that He's not divisible, that the triune Godhead is not made of parts. If He was made of parts, He could come apart. And if He was made of parts and could come apart, that would seem to suggest that He would be a being that is contingent or dependent on something else holding His parts together. So divine simplicity under the characteristics of God or the attributes of God is that God is indivisible. And you see that in the Nicene Creed, and you see it in various systematic theology books, although some of the systematic theology books that we have today, you're lucky, you're fortunate if you see one paragraph or a footnote explaining the simplicity of God. You will for sure see the simplicity of God defended in Norman Geisler's 4-volume set, Systematic Theology. So when we say here, what kind of necessary being could God be? You and I are made of parts. We have a body, we have a soul. God is spirit, John 4:24, and those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. So we would, in that sense, be made of parts, whereas God is not made of parts. He is a simple being, meaning He is not divisible, so to speak. So when we get into what kind of necessary being could God be, according to Richard Swinburne, you're going to hear words of simplicity. What do we mean by God being a necessary being? For example, God cannot not be. He is pure I amness. He just is pure isness. He just is, so to speak. So here is his paper. It's just a 2-pager, and I think this is very healthy philosophically to think about these things. He says here, I understand by metaphysical necessity the strongest kind of necessity there is, and by metaphysical impossibility, the strongest kind of impossibility, and so by metaphysical possibility, the weakest kind of possibilities or possibility there is. I assume initially that the possibility, etc., belongs to sentences. The rules of language states the truth conditions and many entailments of its sentences. I call a rule, for example, what one is objectively committed to by a sentence. A rule of a minimalist entailment would be a mini-entailment, such as if anyone asserts that S is thereby, in virtue of the rules for the correct use of language, committed to S, which entails if they can be joined by a chain of many-entailments such that S1 many-entailments sum S2, many entails sum S3. This is boring. This is just the introduction. We'll get into some of the good stuff in a minute. So if you're not writing all this down or listening to it a few times, I know you will probably be lost. But we're going to get to some meat here in a minute. I assume a common language assumption that the process of language acquisition produces sufficient agreement on the rules of that language for any speaker to use words in an agreed, correct way to make whatever claims he wishes to make. Now, logical necessities, etc., are those metaphysical, remember, beyond the physical, metaphysical necessities, etc., which are discoverable a priori. A priori in philosophy means prior to, are discovered a priori. I argue, which is Swinburne, that any logically impossible sentence, etc., which are divorceable a priori, would entail a contradiction of a sort. I argue that any logically impossible sentence entails a contradiction. Any logically necessary sentence is such that its negation, to the contrary, entails a contradiction, and any logically possible sentence is one which does not entail a contradiction. I defined a rigid designator of anything, of a thing here, as an informative designator. If anyone who knows what the designator means, that is, has the linguistic knowledge of how to use it, knows then a set of conditions necessary and sufficient in any possible world for a thing to be that thing, i.e. God in this case, whether or not he can state those conditions in words. I was attending this lecture, so I just have to share these notes with you. I define a rigid designator as an uninformative designator if these conditions are not satisfied. To know, epistemologically for example, to know these conditions for the application of a designator, as I shall understand this expression, just is to be able, when favorably positioned with faculties, memory, perception, logic, etc., when favorably positioned with faculties in working order, everything's up to par or up to snuff mentally, and not subject to illusion, to recognize where the informative designator, or if it's defined in words, the words by which is defined, applies, and where it does not, and to know the many entailments of a sentence in which it occurs. Now, a sentence is metaphysically necessary, whether it's impossible or possible, if it is logically necessary, impossible or possible. When we substitute co-referring informative for uninformative designators. So, it is the connections of meaning and reference to human language, together in the case of some sentences, which, or with certain logically contingent truth, logically dependent truths, for example, about which are the molecules of which whatever is the transparent stuff in our rivers and seas are made. And these, of course, determine which sentences are metaphysically necessary. So God here, thus far, our presupposition is God is a necessary being. That's where we're headed. Hence, given a common language assumption, we can, in principle, settle the logical status of any sentence. And with a a posteriori, after looking at the facts, you have a priori and a posteriori, and with some a posteriori knowledge can settle the metaphysical status of any sentence. A negative existential sentence, which is a sentence which has to form, quote, there is no X such that there is no X. Ascertain that a certain property or conjunction of properties is not instantiated, that cannot entail a contradiction. So there is no logically necessary sentence of the form, there is an X such that non-X, when non-X, designates a definite description of God. Hence no substitution for God in, quote, there is an X such that X is God, which would equal there is a God. Of a co-referring designator will therefore yield a logically necessary sentence. And so, God exists cannot be metaphysically necessary in this case. If, however, we suppose otherwise, and suppose that there is no X such that X is God entails a contradiction, we have to suppose that innumerable other sentences of kinds which could have been paradigm examples by which students were introduced to the concept of, quote, a logically possible sentence would turn out to be impossible. For example, nobody is perfectly good as far as humans go. If, however, we suppose that necessity, etc., belongs to propositions such as timeless entities existing independently of sentences which express them, then there is some plausibility, seemingly true, some plausibility in the claim that, quote, there is a God might therefore express a metaphysically necessary proposition. This is heavy stuff. This is as good as it gets, as confusing as it gets once you get it down. But I'm going to stop here for a sentence. This is an introduction to philosophy. In time, if you continue reading the Christian philosophers, you will get to stuff like this, and you might just find a little nugget, a little piece of gold that'll help clear up a lot of things as you go through some of these lectures from other philosophers other than Swinburne. So here he goes, 4, reason being, 4, then there would be no reason to suppose that all necessary propositions which can be expressed can be shown by us to be necessary, because the demonstrations thereof may depend on a deduction which proceeds by means of propositions of kinds which cannot be expressed and or modes of inference available only to superior beings. There is no reason to suppose that there are propositions. But if we suppose that there are necessary propositions, there will be innumerable such propositions not explicitly about God, which will constrain what God can do. If we claim that it is a brute fact that these propositions are part, there we go, propositions, part of God, this would be non-simplicity, right? If we suppose that that these propositions are part of God's nature, that would make God essentially a very unsimple being. If we claim that God has a nature such that necessity, or that he necessarily creates these truths, then since God can create only what is good, there must be necessarily true propositions independent of God to the effect that certain necessary true propositions are good propositions, because he can only create that which is true. Either way, God seems less great than he would be if there were no propositions. Now, I've always said these propositions flow from the nature of God. He didn't invent any truths. Truths don't stem from the will or volition of God. They flow. They're eternal truths that flow from God's being. If he could dream something up tomorrow, that means he can learn, and we can add to his divine omniscience. And so if God is omniscient, obviously, he knows everything that there is to know. And some philosophers have argued that God is so omnipotent, so powerful, that he can choose to forget part of his divine foreknowledge. I think that is erroneous, because you can't erase 12.5% of your divine omniscience. Divine omniscience is past, present, future. It means God knows everything that there is to know, period. So some of our new neo-theists, as they've been labeled by some, are redefining what we mean by omniscience. And you can tie that together by saying divine simplicity is wrong. God is made of millions or billions of parts. And if that's true, then it could come apart. This is so important, by the way, to use a more common example. Many Christians are confused as to what happened at the cross. Was Jesus truly separated from the Father? And I wrote a paper back in seminary on that subject, and I call it separation theology. It's argued that when Christ went to the cross and the sins of the world were placed upon him, God is so holy, according to Habakkuk, that he cannot look upon sin. And then you have 2 Corinthians, Paul says, look, he who knew no sin became sin for us. Based on that alone, it's argued that the sins, as if it was stuffness, something, was placed upon Christ. And thine eyes are pure eyes then to behold evil, which is pulled from Habakkuk. They stretch it to the degree that when the sins of the world were placed upon Jesus, he became literal sin. You know, the sinless one became literal sin. And so there was a separation between the two. The Father turned his back on Christ, and Jesus became sin, and God can't look upon sin. Well, if God is made of parts, then that's possible. Right? But I don't think it's possible because he is simple. The triune Godhead cannot be separated. And if there was a separation between the Father and Son, and they ontologically share the divine nature, the triune Godhead, what would happen if you separate them? You just rip the Trinity in half. And now we'd have to apologize to some of the cultists who argue the similar fashion, you know, that Jesus was a first created being, etc., etc., referring to Jehovah's Witness theology. We'd have to apologize now if there was a literal separation. You might argue that there was a judicial separation on our behalf, but Jesus couldn't become literal sin. Furthermore, who would place the sin upon Jesus? Did the Father walk over there with a file and just dump it on Christ? Well, you can't touch it, as if sin is something that floats around in the world, and if you touch it, you're going to become evil. No, sin is a departure from the way things ought to be. It's not just missing the mark, it's intentionally hitting the wrong mark. So in that sense, Jesus did none of those things. I think if you understand Paul in 2 Corinthians, I think it's 5:21, where it says, he who knew no sin became sin for us. For the Jewish mindset, especially with a rabbinical background, I don't think Paul had in mind, given the context of Old Testament, even rabbinical law, that Christ somehow became literal sin. We hear that from various pulpits, and granted, a lot of pastors don't think about this. And I think it's if you're a seminary student or attending university or Bible college, you should definitely hear this. And chances are 9 out of 10 you're not going to hear that anywhere else from here, because most people don't think about this. But it's good stuff. So if God is made of parts, sure, you could rip the Trinity apart. But now we're tritheists. Now we're not monotheists, because you can't rip the divine Godhead apart. So in one sense, you could say, of course, that Jesus fulfilled all the Old Testament sacrifices by means of a type. But say, for example, a scapegoat in the Old Testament. If I approached a goat and put my hands on that goat symbolically to transfer my sin, it's not like that goat ran into, the Sinai desert becoming evil or like a demon or black or stained, and God can't even look at the sheep or the goat. Moreover, when we're saying that God turned his back on Christ because he can't look upon sin, God doesn't have eyes. He's spirit. He doesn't have a back. He's omnipresent. So if he turns around, what's going to happen? Well, he's still there, present with Christ, and he still shares the divine nature with the second person of the Trinity. So that would be an example that if you think of divine simplicity, that God is not made of parts, and think about that in light of the separation allegedly that happened on the cross, I think you will beg to differ, that there was no separation, literal separation whatsoever. All right, so having said that, that's how important this stuff can be. Now, moving on to Swinburne. We left off on There is no reason to suppose that there are propositions. We covered that point. Either way, God seems less great, he says, than if there were no propositions. But the fact that we cannot make sense of the concept of a metaphysically necessary being has no relevance to the possibility of making sense of and constructing a cogent argument to the existence of a being necessary in some other sense. For example, a being not casually or causally contingent on the existence of any other being for its own everlasting existence. So this would then be a property which all traditional theists have believed God to be. Very healthy. I will go ahead and scan this paper and upload it, because I know this is confusing. If you even follow through to the end of this presentation or lecture, I think you will definitely want this uploaded. So I will upload that as well. In any event, we will have more YouTube lectures in addition to the classes at our regional cohort facility. And if you recall, the first week we did not have a live lecture or an uploaded lecture. So at the Harbor, we will actually go one more week, which will cross into World Religions that we start on the 27th. All right, we'll see you soon. Lord bless, and keep up the good work.